Welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at the Community Policy Forum. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities here in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. On 14th May, we were pleased to facilitate the launch of a new report in Parliament that has been conducted by Keele University, entitled #Contesting Islamophobia, Representation and Appropriation in Mediated Activism. This research explores the intricate dynamics surrounding the use of social media to counter Islamophobic narratives, particularly in the wake of pivotal socio-economic events such as Brexit, the Christchurch mosque terror attack, and the global upheaval caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. By using these three trigger events and drawing upon an extensive analysis of over 3 million tweets, the report's authors have endeavored to unravel the mechanisms through which hate speech proliferates and gains visibility within the digital landscape. At the same event, Community Policy Forum launched Breaking the Cycle, a roadmap to combating online hate, which is a supplementary report that seeks to provide a policy perspective to this new and important research. To discuss this timely report, we are joined by Professor Elizabeth Poole and Hana Kojakovic. Elizabeth is a professor of media and communications at Keele University and is lead author of the new report. She has published widely, including 3 books on the representation of religion and Muslims in the media, an area she has been working in for 25 years. She is currently researching the dynamics of online Islamophobic hate speech, having received funding from the British Academy and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC. Hannah is a project manager with several years of experience in the civil society sector. Hannah is currently managing 2 projects within Media Diversity Institute. One of these projects, Get the Trolls Out, aims to combat discrimination and intolerance on religious grounds in Europe. The second project, Reporting Diversity Network, focuses on effectively influencing media representation of ethnicity, gender, and religion in the Western Balkans. Hannah's work predominantly focuses on equality, diversity, and combating hate speech in the online and offline media landscape. Thank you both for taking time out to join us in today's episode of our podcast. So, first, I wanted to come to yourself, Elizabeth, and ask that you please summarize the main findings of your research.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'd just like to say that the research took place in quite an interesting historical context because it was after the QAnon purge of Twitter, after the Capitol Hill riots, and before Elon Musk took over the platform. So there was a lot stricter moderation of Twitter, which was the platform that we did the analysis of. And actually, what we found was a lot more support towards Muslims than we expected, although this differed across different events. So, for example, our first Brexit date range, which was around the last general election in the UK, found that generally users were more supportive towards Muslims attacking the government for their Islamophobic rhetoric. While as the first date range that we looked at during the COVID pandemic was quite antagonistic, blaming Muslims, for example, for spreading the virus. But that was it was coming from more of a kind of Indian users rather than the UK. So, and with the Christchurch terror attack, we found that initially there was a lot of positive support, but this kind of gave way to more kind of negative discourse about censorship and gun laws as time went on. So we found in this context that the platform was being moderated more strictly than it is now and it had been previously. And therefore, a lot of explicit racism had been deleted. But there was still a lot of implicit racism there, and even, abuse, including the Christchurch terror attack video. The live stream of that was still on the platform, despite this stricter moderation, and despite the fact that we reported it several times. So I think the research shows that moderation can be effective, but it is patchy. It was patchy then. You know, a lot of US accounts have been deleted, but less so in India, where a lot of the negative discourse was coming from, or the negative narratives. So our argument is that social media platforms like Twitter can give a lot of visibility to counter narratives against Islamophobia, but this can be quite fleeting and can often give way to kind of negative discourses about Islam and Muslims as that kind of those counter narratives die down after an event. But what we also find is there's a lot of interaction between these kind of like dominant negative narratives and counter narratives, which can be problematic because obviously when you engage with negative narratives, you amplify them. But in other ways, in some cases, we saw that, you know, the more negativity you saw on there, the more pushback that you got. So the more people shared counter narratives. So it can have this kind of like positive amplifying effect as well. So those are the kind of main arguments that we found, or findings after the analysis.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So, kind of using that to segue into the rest of the discussion, Hannah, I wanted to come to yourself, and obviously having also spoken at the event in Parliament and having gone through the report, how do you feel the findings and recommendations that Elizabeth and her colleagues have put forward can be used to inform your work on tackling Islamophobia and hate speech more generally on social media?
Thank you, and thank you also for the introduction. So having looked at the report, I picked out a few that really stuck with me as recommendations. The first would be the duty of care. So we obviously work with a very sensitive topic, and it's therefore very important that we are aware how we communicate these topics. Obviously, words have meaning, and we need to be very conscious of the impact of ours. Furthermore, if we're building trust with marginalized communities, I think showing a duty of care is vital. Another important point was to have more transparent policy for IT companies. So this is something that we, throughout our work, struggle with a lot, because there is a big gap between us on the ground to monitor the level of hate present in the media and those at the top who are implementing, or in some cases not implementing, mechanisms in place to counter hate and remove illegal content. So on the back of that, I think data sharing is also extremely important, because there are a lot of organizations on the ground who are monitoring hate. And I think the more that we can share with each other, the more proof and evidence we also have to influence policy and broader mechanisms in place. And equally, that ties in very well with cooperation with activists and other CSOs, so sharing best practices, working as a team, and also campaigning together, because there is always power in numbers, and sort of bringing those expertise together. And lastly, one of the recommendations stood out was the investment in technology. So in the current phase of our project, we've actually introduced AI to help us monitor hate speech on a much larger scale, and also because this can kind of break the constraints and limits of human capability. So it's something we're still exploring, but I definitely think that technology can also prove helpful in that way, to combine both human and AI capabilities in monitoring, countering hate.
Thanks, Hannah. So, Elizabeth, you mentioned that the research was conducted at sort of a specific historical moment and obviously kind of focused on some particular trigger events. So, since the research was conducted, what kinds of trends have you and your fellow researchers noticed when it comes to online hate speech and Islamophobia, particularly with an election coming up? What are your general thoughts?
Yeah, so we've been monitoring Twitter, or X as it is now, since 2016. And when we first did some research on Twitter, we found a lot of US right-wing accounts using Twitter to amplify their agendas, and in the case of that particular time, supporting Trump's as he was his election campaign to become president. But we noticed during our research that a lot of these US users had shifted from Twitter to other platforms. And the kind of like users that were left were more kind of like less organized individuals, and also coming from other national context. So, for example, India was quite prominent in terms of the COVID pandemic. So we've seen that kind of shift in usage and those kind of geographical shifts. Obviously, we haven't done any first-hand research since these particular cases, since we did this analysis of coronavirus. But we know that research that has been done by other organisations has shown that since the acquisition of the platform by Elon Musk, because of his kind of like free speech position on free speech, a lot of those kind of like deleted accounts have been allowed to return to Twitter, and therefore, in the context particularly of kind of like the Gaza situation, kind of hate speech has risen again on Twitter X. So, that's something to be concerned about. Of course, there has been other recent developments like the Online Safety Act in the UK context, or also hate speech legislation in Scotland. And therefore, we'll see how this plays out in terms of taking action on kind of like online harms and online hate speech in the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just coming back to yourself, Hannah, and again, I mentioned that an election is coming up, and we've already seen this rise in Islamophobia, in hate speech generally, in online spaces, in the mainstream media as well. We saw Nigel Farage's comments the other day on Sky News, for example. Just want to ask you, from your experience, what role do you feel politicians play in perpetuating hate speech, particularly in online spaces?
Thank you. Yeah, I think politicians have an enormously influential platform. And you can see, as you mentioned, with the upcoming elections all over Europe and also the UK elections, that many politicians are unfortunately using their platform at the moment to spread anti-religious hate and rhetoric. We see it played out a lot, both in the UK and all over Europe, with the anti-migrant rhetoric tied in with anti-Muslim sentiments. So there's consistent division and narratives, and they're trying to create this binary of us versus them, when in reality it is all us. But I think politicians have a really big role and responsibility to use their platforms to promote tolerance, diversity, but also to be a voice for the interests of the people. And unfortunately, they're abusing this power and definitely using their platform instead to spread hatred and division. And it's interesting because GTTO is based, Get the Trial is managed by the UK, but we have 6 other partners across Europe. And it's very interesting to see when we do all meet together that these anti-migrant and anti-Muslim sentiments are closely tied all over Europe. And it's really being heightened on the political scale. And we actually did also do a reaction to Farage's interview on last weekend. So we wrote him a letter also to highlight his dramatic rhetoric, and also how he should, and other politicians should, take their platform and use it for good rather than spreading hatred and division, but equally to be accountable for the words and the very problematic sentiments that they do spread.
Thank you, Hannah. I mean, I just wanted to stay with you for a second and just ask kind of what do you think, or what responsibility do you think kind of mainstream media platforms and also social media platforms have in combating and countering online hate speech? What are they doing, and what more do you think they could be doing?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I think we've definitely seen a shift since obviously Elon Musk took over Twitter, much less, because what we do is we try to promote engagement with the media and IT companies. So we track and monitor how many instances of anti-religious hatred, especially incitement to violence, we find on social media platforms, and then we try and those. We also have the Trusted Flagger program with Meta, and we monitor how quickly, but also how responsive IT companies are to instances of anti-religious hate and their removal rate. And it's something we definitely start with, trying to also get in contact with those at the top, who, such as Meta or X, formerly known as Twitter. So that's definitely a gap that we are trying to collect more and more evidence on, so that we can also go to them and have conversations and sort of provide them with information on the ground that we're seeing. And in respect to traditional media, we try and also engage with the journalists and the media outlets. So one of our biggest activities is, you know, when a media outlet or a headline is very problematic or spreading anti-religious hate or generalizing to a whole religious community in a very negative light, then we write complaint letters and we try and explain why what they've said is problematic, how they should change it, moderate it, or remove the hate itself. And also we always offer kind of dialogue. We always offer to meet with them to discuss, because I think often there's this lack of critical media literacy, and that's also very important on all sides, both the media who's in charge of the information they publish, but also us as readers. So I think there's a huge lag in that sense, and especially mainstream media, we see it. They're so quick to just pick up information, polarize society, put sensationalistic headlines of the of clickbait, but actually it's very harmful because the viewership and the readership is very large, and they do have a responsibility of what information they provide to the public.
Thanks, Hannah. In our last podcast episode was with Centre for Media Monitoring, and they released a report recently on the British media's reporting of the war on Gaza. And unsurprisingly, the reporting has been quite poor. So they shared a lot of those kinds of similar sentiments that you did about journalists and editors and those in the media space, of them having a duty and a responsibility to not, rile up, hate, but to actually report in a responsible and an impartial manner. So, Elizabeth, just coming back to yourself, and obviously in the report you've provided a set of recommendations. So I just wanted to tease those out a little bit more and ask particularly in what ways you feel counter speech or counter narratives and positive messaging can be used to mitigate the impact of hate speech online.
Yeah, so obviously our research has shown how positive counter-narrative campaigns can be in terms of highlighting alternative narratives in relation to kind of like reframing mainstream media debates. Um, so, just trying to think of some examples from our data um, in relation to the Christchurch terror attack, although it was very supportive, you kind of had this binary that was set up between, um, good and bad Muslims that we see in the mainstream media. And obviously people were referring to this as the kind of like peaceful Muslims. There was one example of a hashtag that was circulated called peaceful mosques. And what was really good about this is that kind of like it was kind of satirical in a sense of being kind of cynical towards that approach. And it invited people to give examples of kind of more mundane activities and gripes they had, or normal everyday activities that they wanted to share about life in mosques. Just to kind of challenge that kind of like binary between good and bad Muslims, which was really interesting. And of course, there was the Hello Brother hashtag that got a lot of visibility on Twitter at the time, which was mostly tributes to the first victim of the attack, who welcomed the protagonist into the mosque by saying "Hello, brother." And that got a lot of visibility, and then that was reported in mainstream media. So it just shows you how, if there's a lot of visibility around certain narratives, they can enter the mainstream. And we did, we did analyze a lot of media coverage from mainstream media outlets, news outlets, that appeared to be quite neutral, but were, omitted quite a lot of details in terms of certain events. So, for example, there was a man who was jailed in New Zealand for sharing the video, and a lot of mainstream news media outlets kind of just reported this in a very neutral way, whilst there's a lot of detail that was left out about his anti-Muslim activities and his links to white supremacism. So, counter narratives can give some of that context. They can push back against those kind of like negative narratives and provide people with a way of reframing. So I think it's really important for normalizing a different understanding of Muslims in the wider public sphere. And of course, the kind of campaigns that Hannah's involved with, like Get the Trolls Out, the monitoring of counter narratives, the kind of counter narrative campaigns that they do are really important because it's important for organisations to take that on because individuals can be subject to a lot of flack when they get involved in these kind of counter narrative campaigns.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just coming off what Elizabeth has said, Hannah, I just wanted to see whether you had anything to add about the impact of positive messaging, of counter narratives on social media and through your work.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think it's extremely important to have counter narratives and also to deconstruct narratives, because I think it is also a lot to do with providing education and research to individuals and looking more into these very problematic tropes as well that are spread by the media and upheld by the media, both social and traditional. And we focus a lot on countering anti-religious hate. And although it's extremely also important, we are trying as well to highlight positive messaging. So we work with very sensitive topics and marginalized communities. So it's extremely important that we also don't speak for the communities, but rather let them speak for themselves. And obviously working in the field of hate speech, it's quite heavy and occasionally a bit depressing. So I think it's also very important that we remind ourselves of the power of numbers and in our voices and experiences and using the tools we have available to us to fight hate and promote diversity and inclusion, because any individual user can report hate speech online, can find mechanisms to fight hate, but often people aren't aware or they don't feel comfortable. I think that's very important that they know that there are different campaigns, whether it's GTT or others, that they can join to combat anti-religious hatred. And I also think that positive messaging and counter narratives can also be a very powerful tool, especially to bring some light and positivity to the dark corner we sometimes find online. And social media, I think, can definitely also be used, as much as it's used for bad, also for good. And it allows people to counter hate, promote diversity, and also feel more hopeful and encouraged to fight back and positive stories and counter narratives, especially for young people who are more and more in online spaces. I definitely think it's accessible to everyone to, use their voice and space for positive change as well and to counter hate.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Just to round off the discussion, I just wanted to ask yourself, Elizabeth, what's next for the report? I believe you have a book coming out. How's that going?
Yeah, so following the publication of the report, which obviously is more focused on the kind of like data, we're writing an academic book which is focuses on different aspects of the research. For example, we haven't covered the interviews that we did so much in the report, so we'll be focusing a lot on that. What the kind of objectives were of the people who engage on Twitter in these kind of counter narrative campaigns. So yeah, that's the next thing we're kind of focused on. We're going to also, we've kind of like put in funding for an exhibition. As Hannah said, media literacy is very important. So it's a kind of idea to show people how hate speech develops on social media through networks. And we are writing a leaflet for schools as well about the research to try and engage people about the way hate speech develops on social media. So we're doing several things there to hopefully encourage people to engage with the research and also just to think about, how maybe their own engagement online might counter or amplify these kind of negative or positive trends.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, and it's great to hear that there are attempts being made to disseminate this brilliant work to a wider audience, especially to those in schools and academic spaces, and hopefully that does kind of help foster this sense of inclusivity and tolerance, not just online but in our day-to-day lives as well. So thank you once again so much, Elizabeth, and also Hannah, for taking time out to join us for today's discussion. The reports are available on the Community Policy Forum website and will be linked in the description below this video. So make sure you do check out Keele University's report and also Community Policy Forum's report as well on this extremely important area. Do keep up with Community Policy Forum's work. Also keep up with the work of the Media Diversity Institute and Hannah's work at Get the Trolls Out, as they are doing brilliant work. And thank you so much for listening, and take care.